Hola. Hello. 大家好. How many languages do you know? What languages do you know? Raise your hand if you've heard a question similar to this before. I assume many of us have. This is a very common question, and we hear it very often. But do you know what we don't hear as often? How many languages can you read and write? This is because the spoken word frames our world. Knowing to speak implies you understand. This is particularly true for languages with alphabets, like Romantic languages, English, Spanish, Portuguese, Latin. But for other languages, like Chinese, where there's no alphabet, and knowing to speak does not guarantee you know how to read and write, this is not the case. My name is Ken, and I'm here to talk about my journey around the world and my potentially more arduous and stressful journey of learning to truly understand Chinese. You see, I was born in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and for the first 5 years of my existence, I spoke Portuguese with everybody around me, and I spoke Chinese with only my parents. I then moved from Brazil to Mexico City. There I began my formal education in letters, and I learned to read and write 2 languages in particular, English and Spanish. I was able to write simple things like Mother's Day and Father's Day cards, thank you letters, birthday cards. In school, I used English to communicate with most of my teachers. Y fuera de la escuela, usaba el español con mis amigos en la calle o cuando iba de compras, etc. These languages are different, but they're very similar because they share a common root, a common alphabet, and a common perspective from the West. So they made sense. What made much less sense to me was at the age of 12, I found out the terrifying news that I was about to come to China. Yes, a Chinese person in China. Terrifying, I know. But why terrifying, especially for me? Because my Chinese was in shambles. I never lived in China before, and although I could understand and I could speak Chinese, the characters themselves were as foreign to me as the country. The best thing I could do at that time was say the pinyin, which is basically a system using letters from the Romantic alphabet to help Chinese learners pronounce Chinese characters correctly. So I was nervous. I would not only be sounding out all these new characters and the pinyin alphabet in China, I would be sounding out a new life as well. At the age of 12, I came to BASISInternationalSchoolShenzhen, and many of you may not agree with me, but I found Chinese to be the single most hardest class ever. I was sitting at the back of the room, praying not to be called on, and when I went home, I banged my head against the table or whatever I could find to try to make sense of this language. Chinese homework took me the longest to complete. However, that is not to say I didn't enjoy certain aspects of Chinese class. During these couple years of me learning Chinese, I found out many interesting things. For example, did you know that the pinyin system I mentioned earlier is actually a very, very recent invention? It was created in 1958, so pinyin is actually younger than my yeye. Again, pinyin is a system that uses letters from the Romantic alphabet to help people pronounce Chinese characters. And this is very important, because pure Chinese characters tell you nothing about how they're supposed to be pronounced. All these characters look different and mean different things, but they're all pronounced the same way, yi. And all these characters, although they look similar, they have different meanings, and they're pronounced completely differently. Ji, yi, si. Whereas for phonic languages, when you learn to speak, you also know how to read and write, because the letters make up the words that spell out the spoken language. In Chinese, you could know the pinyin, but you would not be able to speak or write. You first have to master 2 separate systems of notation, the pinyin system and the Chinese character system, and blend these 2 seamlessly before you can actually use the language. Because of this, Chinese in general will take more time, more effort, and more patience to learn than many other languages. I later became acquainted with the strict rules of calligraphy. The order of stroke is very important, and there's no room for flexibility. Let's take this character, for example. Ko generally means mouth, and it technically is just a square, or a rectangle if you want to be very technical. But ladies and gentlemen, this is no ordinary rectangle. This is a sophisticated rectangle, because this rectangle can only be written following this path. And maybe you can imagine, I was particularly irritated with this discovery because it's just another layer of complexity that I had to master before I could actually use the language. But as the logical reasons behind this strictness became clear, so did the language itself. You see, following this predetermined order actually helps in making characters look a lot more beautiful. But most importantly, it helps with memorizing how a character is written. In an experiment done on Italian Chinese learning students, it was found that those who followed the strict rule of left falling strokes before right falling strokes and horizontal strokes before vertical strokes performed way better in dictation than freestylers did. For my own interest of studying Chinese, I quickly adhered to these rules myself. More than the order of the stroke, Chinese characters are actually hieroglyphic, which means that a lot of them began as pictograms. We have fire, water, wood, and mountain. These characters look like the object they represent. And then as civilization developed, more and more complex objects, abstract ideas had to be given a character. And what did the Chinese do? They took all of these pre-existing characters and smashed them together in different ways. Let's look at an example. Wood. Some ancient Chinese people may have been roaming around their civilization, and after looking at a tree, mimicking its shape, they created this character. And since trees gave people wood, they logically named this wood. After exploring a little bit farther into the unknown, they may have found themselves in a forest. And what is the characteristic of a forest? A lot of trees and a bunch of wood. And what is the forest character in Chinese? 3 woods, or 3 trees, smashed together. Groundbreaking. So, although there are more than 100,000 Chinese characters in existence, all of the ones that we commonly use in daily interactions are really made up of the same couple hundred components. So a Chinese learner only has to master how to write these couple hundred, and the rest are just combinations of these. Which is good news, right? Much better than if all 100,000 characters were different and each had to be remembered separately. Lastly, Chinese grammar is not as sophisticated as the grammar for many other languages. In fact, Chinese grammar reminds me of my dad, especially the verbs. My dad, stoic guy, no expression, no emotions, never changes. On the other side, for languages like Latin and Spanish, their verbs are much more creative. They're much more excited. They always want to change their endings, add something on, take something away. Yo amo. I love. Tú estás amando. You are loving. Ellos amarán. They will love. The verb in Spanish for love is amar. But in all 3 examples, you never heard amar. You always heard a sort of deviant form of amar. That is because these verbs always change, depending on the subject, depending on the verb tense, and many other things. For Chinese, verbs are not conjugated. I'm going to use the same examples. 我爱, I love. 你在爱, you are loving. 他们会爱, they will love. The Chinese verb for love is ai, and you heard ai in all 3 examples. And in any case, ai is always written like this, and it's always said like this, because again, they're not conjugated. To make things even easier, Chinese nouns have no gender. So never do you have to worry about wrongly assuming that a table is a male when she in fact identifies herself as a female. Pretty neat, right? So many aspects of Chinese grammar are simpler than other languages. Yes, there may be an overwhelming amount of characters to remember. But the convenience of Chinese grammar really compensates for this inconvenience of learning to read and write Chinese, making Chinese, at the end of the day, a language that is definitely learnable by anyone who commits to it. Researcher Chanya Priaswari. I don't speak Indonesian. If you do, I'm sorry for making you cringe. She's a researcher at the 10th of November Institute of Technology, and she explains that studying foreign languages helps teach an importance of respecting others. It also helps foster the knowledge of knowing the interrelation between your language and human nature. So don't let Chinese or any other language intimidate you. Learning the rules, and thus the language, will help you unlock an understanding about the people and the culture. Foreign languages help expand one's view. They also help with liberalizing one's experiences, and also makes one more flexible and tolerant. And in an increasingly tense world, we could all use a little more tolerance. So, aprende un lenguaje nuevo, gain a new understanding, and 更好地了解自己。